Thanks, Kerry, and thank you for the opportunity to talk today. I've got the graveyard shift, so I wanted to start with a quick quiz. It's a what am I question. I'm a significant overhead cost. I've increased as much as 600%, in some cases more, over the past 10 years. I can change annually. You can't manage me, and I'm difficult to reduce. The principles behind why I'm paid are varied, but are largely a reflection of our history and our geography. So what am I? Land rent, yeah, absolutely. And I guess I'm talking today because land rent and leasehold tenure is an issue that my family's been dealing with for a number of years, and it's not just us dealing with it. 2/3 of the state is leasehold land, and about half of the leases are term leases. So for us, despite last year's positive changes, land rent and leasehold tenure remains a significant issue. We're still concerned about how much rent we're going to be paying into the future, what conditions will be posed on our lease, and whether freeholding will ever really be a viable option. I guess I'm also concerned with, at the end of the day, what do we really own? So back in 2007, we did have green grass back then. We certainly don't now. But we were looking at our land rent increasing from about $8,000 to $85,000. That was when the cap was to be removed in 2017. By 2017, we'd be paying $85,000. And that was a factor of our UCV increasing. So our UCV on one of our term leases increased from $590,000 to $3.6 million over a couple of years. I recently heard of a case in the Gulf where a UCV over a 2-year period went from $900,000 to $7.2 million. And at the same time, of course, the rating increased. So we went from 0.8% to 1.5%. At the same time, our family was going through a 10-year renewal process, and over that same time we shifted from a 60-year lease to a 30-year lease. Our previous lease required us to develop the Brigalow and construct dams. Certainly the new lease, there were no parameters for further development beyond our PMAV areas. We were also required to undertake environmental risk assessments. So we were paying more rent, we were on reduced terms, and we had more conditions imposed on our lease. So the land tenure narrative had clearly changed. I certainly felt during that time, this was during the Bligh government, we certainly went from landholders to lessees, and at worst we were mere renters. And I remember at that time, my husband and I were driving down our road, one of the council roads that go through our property, and there was a Queensland government vehicle pulled over, and they were having lunch. There was a carload of people, and we just sort of talked about what we were doing, and they were driving around doing land erosion surveys, and we said, oh, we're just going up the road to clear a fence line. And they kind of joked and said, don't worry, we won't tell anyone. And while that was a light-hearted comment, it certainly reflected for me how much, the tone of Grazing and the tone of Prime Ministry had changed during that period. I think they were fairly dark days in terms of landholder rights and graziers' rights. So the narrative had clearly changed during that time. The last significant leasehold review was in the 90s, the Wolf Review. Key principle to come out of that review was that, firstly, landholders had to have the capacity to pay rent. There needed to be a basis and a capacity to pay the amounts of rents that were being charged. They also said as a key principle that rents must not hamper or retard development, but should encourage development of the public estate. And I think in 2007, this principle had clearly been lost. This is a quote from one of the submissions made from WWF and the Queensland Conservation Council at that time, where they were clearly suggesting that graziers should be paying market rents on their leasehold land. And at that time, there were ministers from Brisbane in the media saying that Brisbane residents would be happy to pay the same rates of rents offered to leasehold graziers. And they kept rolling out a figure that the average rent paid by us graziers was $1,500 a year. And that was probably true when you applied it by the 20,000 plus leases that the Crown Land had on its books. But when you looked at what term leases were paying, it was well over an average of $20,000. So we'd clearly gone from a view that rent should be concessional for good reason to rent should be commercial value. So I was really concerned about these issues. $85,000 for our business was a significant cost, and when you add rates to that, we were looking at land rent and rates being one of our largest costs, and at certain times we'd be paying the government more than we'd be paying ourselves. So I directed my energy into, I guess, first of all, objecting to our UCV. And we have been successful a number of times to reduce our unimproved capital value. We've reduced across both our leases by about $1 million. And I also got involved in the AgForce Leasehold Land Committee. And I do have at times a love-hate relationship with AgForce, but I believe you've got to be a member of something, and you've got to be inside advocating and trying to make a change. And I certainly believe that was a really successful committee. I'm bipartisan, but it certainly wasn't until LNP got into power that we even were able to have a meeting with government to start talking about some of these issues. As a landholder, in the previous Labor government, there was certainly no window of opportunity to talk with government about some of the changes we wanted to see. So LNP really opened the door to us not just talking about the issues, but talking about alternative methodologies for land rent and talking about other possibilities for tenure security, moving term leases into more secure tenure forms. So the government also formed the Ministerial Roundtable on state land rent, which I was a member of. I think, looking back, it was a fairly token gesture. There was 2 landholders on a committee of 12. But I think we were successful in that committee at pointing out the issues of capacity to pay, so looking at the profitability issues in the industry and really highlighting that capacity to pay was a significant issue that the government needed to get serious about. The government also undertook, around the same time, the inquiry into relevance of government tenure. Rob Carter was a member of that review, and if you read through that document, as he suggested you do, there are some fantastic recommendations in that review. And I think that while not all of them were put forward and used, the committee was made up of largely Brisbane-based MPs, and it really gave them an insight into what the issues we were dealing with, and I felt that we were really well received through that review process. So roll on to 2014. I guess quite a bit has changed. As David said, we've got more affordable rural rent and freeholding, so that the ratings have changed. You can now freehold for 20% of your UCV. And just to give you some data, to date 271 deeds of grant using the net present value formula have been issued since 2014, and a further 808 cases are currently open. So obviously landholders are taking up that opportunity. Interestingly, of the 808 cases, 165 of those are term leasees who are applying for freeholding. So these are leasees who obviously don't feel they have to answer to the native title issues, or are unaware that may be an issue that they need to look at. I've also heard that there are some accounting and legal firms that are just openly encouraging all clients to apply for freeholding, with the view that a new resolution will come about the next few months to dissolve native title. I wish it was that easy. To date, there have been 2 successful ILUA negotiations, but these are both small areas on the coast, and they commenced in one case 11 years prior to the ILUA being approved. So it took 11 years for that to get through. So there's been no successful ILUAs since the July 2014 announcement. I guess that the other significant change was the removal of the restrictions that have prevented corporations from holding certain rural leases and limited the number of rural leases that can be owned by individuals. I felt this was an area that probably needed wider debate than it did have. These restrictions have been in place for decades and were introduced to assist in protecting family farms. And I certainly know of a few sales in our area in North Queensland that possibly these were sales that were taken up by family farmers, and possibly post-2014 there would have been a lot more competition for those sales with foreign investment, and that may have been a missed opportunity for those family operations. So the whole notion of protecting the family farm is now sort of deemed outdated. I mean, is there merit in the future at looking at different policies that afford different leasehold rules for family farms over foreign or large corporate investors? And I guess time will tell, particularly as the level of foreign investment increases. So while it's clear the changes announced last year give us greater security and more affordable rental options, this security only remains as long, as the next policy debate. So change of government, the next whim, the next idea that comes around, we're back out there, trying to either hold on and maintain this position or lobby for an improved position. I'd like to see the current government publicly commit to continuing freeholding and rolling lease regimes in their current form, and particularly agree to the formula, to the principles of affordable rent, affordable freeholding and greater tenure security. And I think they like freeholding at the moment because it's a cash injection. I wonder how supportive they are of the actual principles of affordable freeholding and land rent, and I think it'd be great to hear them publicly support those principles. So some of the key learnings that I take with me through this experience. The first one is that as lessees, you should be well across your UCV, and you should feel that you can object if you feel you have a case. I'm constantly surprised how many lessees don't know what their UCV is, don't know how rent's calculated, don't know that they can actually object to those UCVs. While at times I think as producers we feel as if we've got objection fatigue, we're constantly having to object to everything. This is something I think that's really worthwhile and objecting to. Only about 0.5% of the total number of landholders object to valuations, so a very small percent. But just the other day I heard of another successful case where a leasee was able to reduce their UCV by 1.5 million to 610,000, and from 930,000 to 650. So the key steps for me in objecting to your UCV is, first of all, knowing your land classifications and the areas of those land classifications. And I've argued with the department that these classifications should be on your valuation notice. But I have had approval from Neil Bray. He suggests that if you want to get those classifications, you should be able to contact the department and they should give those classifications to you. So particularly in my neck of the woods where you have sort of broad variations of land types, you need to be across those land types and the areas of those land types, particularly the PMAV areas, because if you look at your PMAV, there's not an area attached to it, it's a series of GPS coordinates. And it's so easy for those areas to be miscalculated. So that's the first step. Before you contact your legal representative or a valuer, be across your own land classifications, know what areas each land type is, and then start looking at the values. Look at relativity, look at how you're valued compared to your neighbours. Get involved in your Shire's land valuation committee. So each Shire should have a committee whereby the valuers get together once a year with landholders in the area, and they present the sales evidence to you and they argue the case for why valuations are going up or down. We've only recently sort of reenacted that committee in Charters Towers, and last year we looked at, there was really 4 sales in the Shire that were used as sales evidence. 2 of those sales were sales that were well below market value. They were sold for below UCV values. So one property previously sold for above 7 million, its UCV was 3.2, it sold for something like 2.9. So the 2 sales that went ahead for below UCV values, there were 2 that were at market value, and our UCVs went down by 8%. So I was pretty disappointed with that response. It's a tough job, but I think you've got to keep at it. The challenge there, and I'll talk about it a little more later, is that UCVs is the basis for calculating land rent, and that was an issue that we took to the government as part of the review. It doesn't make a lot of sense, why we're basing land rent on UCVs. And really we're one of the few states left that are doing it. Other states have moved towards more progressive formulas. The second, I guess, key learning is that we need to change the narrative. So the narrative in the mid-2000s definitely shifted from the view that rents were concessional for well-justified reasons. So we went from that view to graziers were being subsidised by the public and we should be paying commercial rents. So adjustment rates on leasehold land. And these sound bites helped to develop policy. And I think industry was slow to respond with our own narrative, and that was to our detriment. I guess one of the sound bites that I kind of constantly put forward is you shouldn't have to buy the farm twice. You shouldn't have to buy a lease at market value, which is comparative to freehold, and then have to buy it again through rent or through freeholding. And again, we're one of the few countries where you have to, one of the few countries where you have to pay an upfront capital cost on a lease. The other key learning is that we have to have a clear preferred position. Conversations in corridors, remarks over coffee underpins policy formation. And as an industry, we need to have our preferred position in our back pocket ready to raise if the opportunity arises. And I guess this was brought home to me when I looked at the reason why this 20% capping arrangement came about in 2007, which at the time I guess was made with good intentions, but it created a raft of problems and confusion which really fed into the hands of government. It meant that different lessees were paying anywhere from 0.4 to 1.5%. So it certainly didn't help our case in arguing that there was a problem, because for a whole lot of the industry it wasn't a problem, they were only paying 0.4%. And that was a factor of when their shire was valued and when the freeze came about. So there was a raft of confusion. But that decision was made in a corridor conversation with an Ag Force representative and a minister. And, you know, if Minister Palaszczuk, or Premier Palaszczuk rang me tomorrow and said, you know, Emma, what's the industry's preferred position on this? You know, we still really don't have one. And even with Ag Force, there's still ongoing debate about what the preferred policy is. So I think that's a real lesson, that industry needs to have their preferred policy in their back pocket at all times. So if we're asked, you know, here it is. And to not expect government to come up with that preferred position for us or to have that vision for us. It's certainly got to be us driving that process. So challenges ahead. I guess as more perpetual leases are freeholded, I think term lessees are going to become increasingly exposed to the burden of public expectations on leasehold land. You know, we are the low-hanging fruit that's there for government to impose all sorts of conditions on. The other big challenge, and David touched on it this morning, is negotiating ILUAs. What does an ILUA in agriculture look like? And what happens if nothing happens? What's the outcome? And I guess that's the most likely scenario at the moment, that we get locked into nothing happening because there's no way forward. Can lessees and traditional owners work together to identify pathways for ILUAs? Is it simply about applying a monetary value, or can different opportunities be created? And I heard a story from one landholder who recently sought to freehold a 10-acre line that had previously been a gazetted road. The area was 10 acres and had been valued at $3,500. The value was agreed by the department, subject to native title. They went to the traditional owners, who indicated that a payment of $60,000 would be required for an ILUA to be signed. Of course, nothing happened as a result. The grazier was given a permit to occupy, and the situation goes on. I think there are opportunities to partner with traditional owners on things like ecotourism. There's an opportunity to have a greater traditional owner involvement in natural resource management, including Aboriginal enterprises for land restoration and conservation. But it is hard to see a way forward as an individual landholder. How do you take that on? There's no precedent. I'd also like to see the federal government play a leadership role in opening up discussions regarding pathways for ILUAs in agriculture. And I think this is evolving for mining, so I'd also like to see it evolve, or at least start, for agriculture. I understand that the previous LNP government did have a native title group where ministers and the federal government met to start the conversation about pathways for agriculture, but this is no longer happening. I also know that there's $100 million that's been allocated to native title arrangements through the white paper, and this could be used to start those conversations and start to develop those pathways. But I think it's being used for looking at freeholding in urban areas. Another key challenge is managing the environmental expectations that the public has of agriculture. I've got no problem with the idea that rights evolve to meet the changing expectations of the community. I mean, what rights haven't evolved? Human rights, animal rights, women's rights have all evolved to meet the changing expectations of the broader community, and property rights are no different. But when agriculture is increasingly being asked to carry more of the burden, I think there is an issue that needs to be looked at. And there's no doubt that good environmental outcomes and good grazing outcomes coincide on a whole number of levels. You know, water quality, erosion, ground cover, the outcomes are the same. But where they don't coincide, you know, that's an area that needs to be looked at, and certainly compensation, if the individual is expected to carry the burden, needs to be made. And there's a whole range of ways this can happen. You know, in the UK, farmers are getting £80 an acre, a subsidy, as recognition of the environmental outcomes that they are managing. And they have to maintain the hedgerows so the birds can nest in them. They need to, you know, run rare breeds of cattle because tourists like to drive around and see those rare breeds. Sounds crazy, but there's some acknowledgement that they're carrying a broader public expectation, and so there's compensation for it. In Florida, in the US, 40% of land has been bought back through federal land buyback programs, and this was sugarcane fields that were previously Everglades that have been bought back by the federal government because the environmental value is deemed to be higher than agriculture. Certainly not suggesting we go and, you know, buy back huge tracts of land, but if the public believes that outcome is worth maintaining, they need to pay for it. And I guess also we need to be expecting consumers to pay more for food that reflect the environmental values that they want to see delivered on. I guess the other key challenge is the loss of the prudent purchaser. The whole basis of our valuation system and the use of our UCVs is based on the notion that a prudent purchaser is going to purchase that property and is going to pay no more for that property than what it is worth. So this view of the prudent purchaser who's done the legwork, done their homework, and is going to pay the price for a farm that matches the income off that farm. And for a large period of time, that's what happened. Up until the mid-90s, there was a direct parallel relationship between farm income and properties paid. There was a relationship there between how much people were paying and what they could earn off the property. The mid-90s, that relationship changed. Different interests in land meant that people were prepared to pay, you know, different amounts of money for different types of land for different reasons. But still, we're using that sales price as the basis for informing our UCVs. So whatever anyone is prepared to pay, minus the improvements, that's the UCV. That's the basis for how our UCVs are determined, and that's the problem, Peter, that you highlighted. As part of, you know, the AgForce discussions, we looked at a whole range of different methodologies and tried to get some broader debate about, you know, what was a fair system. But a land rent based on a UCV that might be determined by how much a mine can pay or how much a foreign investor is prepared to pay, that determines how much rent you're going to be paying. It doesn't seem like a fair system. The dynamics of foreign investment. So will local landholders be priced out of the market? Does this matter? Should local small businesses such as ours have the same pressures of rent and tenure applied as large global multinationals? Are they taking the same multi-generational view that most family farm enterprises are taking? Do they uphold the same environmental values? Do they have the same investment in community? These are questions, you know, that we may be asking into the future. The last challenge there is lease viability. Term leasees have to be more profitable than their freeholding counterparts because they need to find another $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 at the end of the day to pay their land rent commitments. And essentially, you know, profitability is a factor of productivity. Productivity is lower in our more marginal country. It's our more marginal country that are largely term leases. Not in all cases, but, you know, in a large part of the state, that's the case. So I think we need to be asking questions about the viability of these leases and what that means in terms of, you know, the land rent impost. And there has to be, you know, vast areas of land at the moment that are paying significant land rent, that have no stock, and probably aren't going to be back in business for a number of years, and they've still got the impost of rents and rates. So what's happening in other countries? Well, there's no doubt that there's global debate occurring about land tenure. If you look at what's happening in developing countries, they're using it for a tool to develop and to lead to rural prosperity, just as has happened in Australia. What is interesting when I look at what's happening in other countries is that only in Australia are you required to make that upfront capital purchase. So one of the few cases, one of the few examples where you've got to buy the property first and then you pay rent on it, buy the lease and then pay rent on it. Probably Canada's the most similar. But in most cases there's no upfront payment, they're simply paying a grazing lease. And often those grazing leases have the same security that we have. They're 20 to 30 year grazing leases and they're simply paying a monthly rental amount. In the US, for example, it's $1.69 sort of per cow-calf unit. In Australia, the Karen Review in New South Wales was a really significant, far-reaching, broad-scale review, and as part of that, they introduced a productivity-based formula. We ran lots of different sort of projections comparing New South Wales to Queensland. As an example, if you were paying $13,000 rent in New South Wales, in Queensland, under the New South Wales formula, you'd be paying $600. In the Northern Territory, the rating has jumped down from 1.24 to 0.0248, and that's a recognition of reduced profitability. When the live export debacle happened a number of years ago, they waived land rent during that period. When they were in drought, the government waived land rent during that period. And they don't have the impost of rates in a lot of those areas. I think Queensland is still behind the 8 ball in terms of what other states are moving towards. So finally, does the family farm, where to for the family farmer? What does this all mean? Does the family farm really matter? I think there is significant tension occurring and significant conversation about, what's in it for the family farm. And if you look at the media, there's this narrative that, the Marpar farmers are on the way out. Part of the profitability issues are because, we're poor managers, we don't have the access to outside capital, we don't have the education levels, we don't have the resources that big business can provide. And so, Paul Howes, a number of years ago, famous, came out and said that, it's the end of the era for Marpar farms. It's all about big business, it's about vertical integration, kind of get big or get out. And I recently completed a Churchill Fellowship where I was looking at how farmers are increasing economies of scale through cooperatives and how they use that to drive efficiencies through the supply chain. And I certainly found that there's this tension. Increasingly, yes, the food supply chain is becoming more corporatised, more consolidated. If you look at the meat processing business, it's really driven by 3 or 4 major players, and they're the same players whether you're in Australia or you're in the US. But what's also happening at the same time is that the consumers are increasingly interested in the integrity of food. And it's only family farmers that can help, give confidence in that food system. So increasingly, yes, it's about the big food business, but consumers are saying, well, we want to know where our food comes from. We want food integrity, we want to know the provenance of our food, and we value the family farm. So I think there's a great opportunity there that, yes, while everything's becoming consolidated and more corporate, increasingly consumers are saying, well, we want to hear the food story, and family farmers are best placed to deliver on that. So I guess the opportunity for family farms, we're going to have, increasing issues and tensions and challenges, and land tenure and leasehold rent is one of them, and it'll continue to be into the future. But I think we've got a real opportunity to work together as an industry cooperatively. I looked at lots of small, medium, large-scale cooperatives in the US and the UK, where small family farmers were able to increase their economy of scale by working cooperatively with their neighbours, with other producers in the industry. And they're able to use that scale to coordinate their supply. They're able to use that scale to buy farm inputs more collectively and get a better deal. And importantly, they're able to use that scale to drive efficiencies back down the supply chain. So they're looking at standardising procedures. They were looking at efficiencies that they could make in how they produce their product and delivering a more consistent product that at the end of the day they were getting more money for. So it led to greater profitability. And I guess that collectiveness enabled them to come together as an industry and have a lot stronger sort of a lobby platform in how they were dealing with government and how they were responding to different industry challenges. So I think that's one of the opportunities. Yes, this sort of whole corporate big business food model, but at the same time, consumers are increasingly wanting to be connected with their food, and I think family farmers are best able to deliver kind of that interest. So I guess in closing, I'd like to encourage you all to become greater advocates. Because just as sometimes manure happens, sometimes policy happens, and it just happens. And unless we're advocates for things like affordable rents, affordable freeholding, and greater tenure security, we're not in a good position to deliver on any of these sort of claims of doubling food productivity, meeting the needs of a global population. So. Manure happens, policy happens if we let it. So let's help inform that debate by being sort of greater advocates. Thank you.